You begin with a quiet assumption that the structure of your thinking provides a reliable map of reality. You trust your interpretations, your judgments, and your conclusions as though they stand on independent ground. Yet Al-Ghazali questions whether the mind can verify the truth of its own operations. If every belief is filtered through the mind, then the mind becomes both the evaluator and the evaluated. You take coherence as confirmation and familiarity as proof, but these are patterns of cognition, not guarantees of truth. Al-Ghazali invites you to consider a different starting point, that certainty may be a psychological comfort rather than an intellectual achievement. You see how easily confidence masquerades as clarity. If the mind affirms itself, what distinguishes truth from habit? Al-Ghazali lived in a world shaped by scholars, jurists, and philosophers who believed that rigorous reasoning could establish secure knowledge. Baghdad was an environment where intellectual refinement carried authority, and argument became the measure of insight. Schools debated logic, theology, and the nature of reality with precision and confidence. Within this landscape, Al-Ghazali rose as a master of rational discourse, yet he sensed an instability beneath the apparent solidity. He saw that brilliant reasoning could still conceal unexamined assumptions, and that intellectual mastery did not guarantee proximity to truth. If a community builds its certainty on intellect, who tests the intellect itself? Al-Ghazali's inquiry deepened when he examined the foundations of human knowing. You assume that perception reveals reality, yet perception depends on conditions you cannot control. You assume that reasoning secures truth, yet reasoning is constrained by premises you did not choose. You assume that memory is trustworthy, yet memory reconstructs rather than simply retrieves. Al-Ghazali confronted these layers and found no form of knowledge that could justify itself absolutely. Instead of despair, he found clarity. The instability did not belong to the world but to the mind's claim of self-sufficiency. The crisis was not a collapse of truth but a collapse of unwarranted confidence. If neither perception nor logic can anchor certainty, what can? You often treat reason as the highest faculty, expecting it to deliver final answers. Yet Al-Ghazali reveals that reason functions within boundaries it cannot transcend. It organizes, compares, and concludes, but it cannot validate the principles that enable these operations. You notice that reason depends on assumptions it cannot prove, such as the reliability of causation or the coherence of the external world. It clarifies relationships but does not generate certainty. Its strength lies in internal consistency, not in establishing ultimate truth. Recognizing this does not diminish reason. It places it in its proper domain. If reason cannot secure the truth of its own foundations, how far can it claim authority? Al-Ghazali's inquiry shifted from the mechanics of thinking to the condition of the one who thinks. You begin to see that knowledge is not simply an intellectual act but a reflection shaped by desire, preference, and bias. When the heart is influenced by inclination, the mind interprets according to those inclinations. When the heart is unsettled, the mind searches for conclusions that provide stability rather than truth. Al-Ghazali argued that clarity requires a purified inner state, not additional argumentation. When desire withdraws, awareness becomes less distorted, and understanding arises without force. In this sense, knowledge is not constructed. It is disclosed when interference subsides. If truth depends on inner clarity, what role remains for analysis? For Al-Ghazali, doubt was not a deficiency but a discipline. You begin to question assumptions you once accepted unconsciously. Each doubt removes a layer of inherited certainty and exposes the structure beneath it. The purpose of doubt is not to destroy conviction but to refine it, allowing only what withstands scrutiny to remain. You see that untested belief is vulnerable, while examined understanding becomes stable. Doubt becomes a form of sincerity. a willingness to release what cannot justify itself. Through this process, belief transforms from imitation to recognition. If doubt refines belief, can belief exist without the willingness to doubt? As your inquiry progresses, you confront a more unsettling question. If the mind cannot justify its own certainty, what remains to guide you? Al-Ghazali described this period as an internal disorientation, not caused by external events but by the dismantling of assumptions that once appeared solid. You begin to see how deeply you relied on inherited structures, cultural expectations, intellectual habits, and patterns of interpretation. These structures shaped your sense of stability, yet you never examined their origins. This realization does not create despair. It reveals the mind's vulnerability to its own constructions. You recognize that the intellect can produce explanations for anything it wishes to defend. It can rationalize desire, justify bias, and reinforce what is familiar. As these habits weaken, a new form of clarity emerges. You understand that reliance on intellect was not reliance on truth but on the comfort of coherence. The collapse of reliance becomes a turning point. You see that the mind can continue to function but cannot serve as the final authority. What was once dependence becomes discernment. The intellect remains useful, but its claims of sovereignty no longer convince you. If the ground beneath your reasoning dissolves, what recognizes the dissolution? Al-Ghazali concluded that true knowledge requires a faculty beyond rational demonstration. This faculty is not a rejection of intellect but an awareness that precedes it. You observe that thoughts appear and fade, yet something remains constant and aware of their movement. This awareness does not argue or infer, it recognizes. It does not build certainty through proof, it reveals the conditions under which certainty becomes possible. Through this recognition, you discover a shift. Understanding is not solely a product of thought but of the clarity with which thought is observed. When the observing awareness is unclouded by bias, knowledge becomes more direct. It no longer depends on constructing elaborate frameworks. Instead, it arises from an inner transparency that allows truth to disclose itself without distortion. Al-Ghazali saw this transition as the renewal of knowing. The intellect does not disappear, it realigns. It becomes an instrument guided by awareness rather than an authority demanding allegiance. You begin to see that certainty is not something achieved by thought but something recognized when thought becomes quiet enough to let understanding emerge. If awareness observes thought, is identity found in the thinker or in the one who notices thinking? As the inquiry settles, you realize that the goal is not to reject intellect but to reposition it. Al-Ghazali affirmed the necessity of reason while exposing its limits. Intellect becomes problematic only when it claims autonomy. When operating without awareness, it repeats familiar patterns and interprets everything through its own expectations. But when guided by inner clarity, it becomes balanced, precise, and sincere. You see that intellect is strongest when it acknowledges its boundaries. It analyzes and explains but does not dictate truth. It interprets reality but does not originate it. Through alignment with deeper awareness, intellect becomes a participant in understanding rather than its source. This integration dissolves the conflict between rational and intuitive knowing. Instead of competing, the faculties harmonize. Reason provides structure, awareness provides insight. Reason clarifies, awareness reveals. You begin to understand why Al-Ghazali saw intellectual humility as a sign of maturity, not weakness. The mind becomes free not by asserting control but by accepting guidance. If surrender strengthens reason, what becomes of the identity that once depended on dominance? With the intellect repositioned, you look for the source of authority that remains stable across doubt, reflection, and insight. Al-Ghazali described this as the awakening of the heart, an inner center of knowing distinct from emotion or sentiment. In this context, the heart refers to a state of awareness that perceives truth without constructing it. It does not rely on argument. It recognizes what aligns with clarity and what arises from confusion. You notice that when the heart is unsettled, the mind becomes restless and interpretive. When the heart is balanced, the mind becomes orderly and precise. This relationship reveals a hierarchy. Intellect does not govern awareness. Awareness governs intellect. Through this shift, you begin to see truth not as a possession but as an orientation. It emerges when the inner state is transparent enough to let understanding appear without distortion. Intellectual achievement becomes secondary to inner alignment. The search for truth transforms from accumulating knowledge to removing what obscures recognition. If truth emerges when the self becomes transparent, what remains of the self that once claimed ownership of truth? As the inquiry concludes, distinctions between intellect, perception, and awareness lose their rigidity. You see that truth was not concealed but overshadowed by the mind's insistence on certainty. When this insistence dissolves, the need to grasp fades. Thought becomes quiet, not by suppression, but by irrelevance. In this quiet, understanding is no longer an achievement but a condition. You recognize that truth does not depend on argument or validation. It reveals itself when the inner movement that seeks possession comes to rest. Al-Ghazali found resolution not in intellectual triumph but in releasing the demand for control. If truth needs no defender, what remains for thought to defend?